So now we're going to have a look at a really simple way of doing a front facing and a front lining on a jacket. We have this sample here, and you'll see that this is it doesn't have a tailored collar, but it has a one-piece collar that has a back stand in it to give it a bit more body. But you'll see when we open it up here, it has a nice wide facing, and that facing goes all the way up into the shoulder, and then it just has a standard front lining where the lining is the same length as the facing at the front, and it just has a tuck towards the side seam here. So really simple, again, can be used for lots of overgarments that don't have a lot of shape in them and fit in them. Really simple technique to learn. Okay, so for this, because it's just a simple shape, we're going to use our dartless front, and looks like I'm going to keep it at the same length. So just to start off with, to make our master pattern, we're going to outline the whole block. Again, this PDF will be on Blackboard, and it's got some instructions here too of how you might want to make the neckline a little bit larger if you want it more casual, because our dartless block has quite a fitted neckline, so you might want to just make the neckline a little bit bigger just for an easier fit and for a more casual style. So I've just traced out the block, and I'm going to add a 2 centimeter extension down the front. So our 2 centimeter extension on both sides will mean that we'll have a 4 centimeter crossover, so you can use a decent sized button on it. And if you were going to put, there's also a note here as well, if you're going to put a zipper down the front of this type of garment, it means that you don't need to add an extension. You just need the seam allowance there, but usually you would take half of the width of the zipper teeth back, so it would come back this way, which is probably like 1/2 centimeter for the width of the zipper teeth on both sides, 1/2 centimeter back, and then you would add a centimeter seam allowance onto that, so you can actually sew the zip onto the front of the garment. But this one here just has our 2 centimeter extension. So what we're going to do now is just create the size of the facing. And what one's this? So we've made this 11. So from our stitch line, that's stitch line. So this one we've gone halfway. On the sheet I've said 10 to 12 centimeters for the width of the facing, and I've gone halfway and made it 11. So that's 11 centimeters from, actually on this one I've said 10 centimeters, 10 to 12 centimeters from the center front back, but this one I've just actually measured it 11 centimeters from the edge, which I suppose is 10 centimeters. And then our width at the shoulder, so a good 5 to 6 centimeters at the shoulder. I'm making this one 6 centimeters, and then just a really nice gentle curve down into that front facing there. Don't make it a corner and then come around. You're going to be sewing the edge of the facing onto the lining, so make it a nice soft corner there. a nice soft curve. And then, along this line here, we're going to have some reference points for notches to help us sew the two pieces together when we've turned, these into separate pattern pieces. So now we've got this piece. What we're going to do straight away is actually trace off the front facing. Now this has a center front extension, but it doesn't have any seam allowances. So once we trace this off, And remember to put a little mark there for those 2 notches as well. Actually, with this neckline here, I know I've traced it out, but I can actually use the block. I can just draw around the block because the neckline hasn't changed. That will give me a neater curve than me trying to do it by freehand. And I'm also going to draw in the center front as well, which is going to be my grain line. And you can write center front on there too. So this is our piece, our facing traced off. Now we need to add seam allowances. So 1 centimeter seam allowance around all edges. Except for the neckline, which will be 6 mil. Okay, so there's our front facing. And on the PDF, you've got cut instructions. So front facing, cut one pair fusing or interfacing, and then the size. And then now, even though this goes on to do the front pattern, I might actually do the lining pattern next. So this section here is actually the last piece. I forgot that I needed to mark in those notches. So very important. And because my armhole hasn't changed, I'm actually going to use the block to trace out my armhole, which you'll see in a moment. What's good about doing these pieces before we actually do the front pattern is that it makes it so that we actually have lengths that are the same, because sometimes what can happen is that once you've got the front pattern and if you're tracing that out, weird things can happen in regard to the lengths of the facing and the front lining. But this way, because we're using the same block, we know that this seam excuse me, this seam here is going to be the same length, and these will sew together correctly. And another thing that happens too is when you're tracing off tracing the pieces off, sometimes you can actually forget. You can think that you've added a seam allowance, but you haven't actually added one. So 1 centimeter seam allowances. So transfer our notches onto the cut edges. This line here we know is parallel to the center front, so we can use that for our grain line. And yes, when you're making a pattern, if you check your patterns, the lining against the facing for a method that's done this way, if these lengths are different, then that means that you've done something incorrect in regard to seam allowances or lengths or something. So front facing and our front lining piece. Now we go back to this one here, and what we need to add here is our front hem allowance. So looks like this one we've added 4 centimeters, so 2 centimeters here on the half scale. And we extend the side seam down to the bottom of the hem, and we extend this line here, which is the seam that joins the facing and the lining, extend that line down to the bottom of the hem as well. Okay, so we know that a hem is like a big seam allowance, so we don't need to add seam allowances onto the bottom of that, but we do need to add seam allowances around the rest of the piece. And what's good about doing it like this too is that because we have the design line of the facing and the lining together, this is like our master copy. It's the outer garment pattern, but it's also the master pattern piece for how the garment, the pattern pieces of the garment. And so we've always got that, as a reference to go back and check things if the toiling process, if something is going a bit odd during the toiling process. So we need a seam allowance at the bottom edge here, and then we also need a seam allowance at the front of the facing, because that folds up, and then so this extension here is the bit, and you can actually see it inside there. So this goes across and then down and then across. So there's actually a seam across the bottom there. And because the lining is shorter, the lining is only this length, it creates a pleat on the side seam, but that goes, and joins the facing flat across the front there. There's lots of different ways of doing this, but this is a really easy, I found it quite a foolproof way of doing the front facing and the front lining that, once you get into the swing of it, it's quite easy to get your head around. Okay, so we have our pieces there. On our PDF, we have the cutting instructions and the labeling. Cut one pair and cut one pair fusing. So in a lot of instances for tailored garments, the whole of the front of the garment, including the hem or seam allowances and everything, the whole piece is interfaced or fused to give it extra support. If you've got a fabric that is actually quite stiff, so if you were using denim or something like that, that you wouldn't put an interfacing on, then you might still want to put a bit of support into the front hem, just to give it a bit of extra body. So in that instance, we would make a separate fusing pattern piece just for that, the front section of the hem. And then we'd also have a strip, that would go across the back hem as well, which we're not making a pattern for today. So it's either the whole front of the garment is interfaced or the front hem is interfaced. You don't interface the whole front of the jacket or garment and then do a separate fusing for that same piece, because it's just unnecessary. And yep, so once they're labeled, they're your 3 pattern pieces you need to recreate this in fabric.